finally happened. Jim Boeheim will no longer be the head coach at Syracuse University after 47 seasons. And it even dates back longer than that. Jim Boeheim was a player at Syracuse. He was an assistant coach and, of course, a head coach. And, for me, there's a lot to discuss. First, I want to give him his due because, what he did for, he was at Syracuse for almost 60 years. Yeah, 60 years. That's just unheard of, to be at the same place as well, where he was there as a player from 63 to 66, an assistant from 69 to 76, and then a head coach from 76 to 2023. And believe he ends up vacated or not. And the vacated wins is a bit ridiculous, but believe he had the second most wins in the history of the NCAA behind Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski. So, Boeheim, he wins the one national championship. And if he hadn't won that, I think that would have, that would have been something that he would have had to have really stuck with, and unfairly or not, when you would have thought Jim Boeheim, you would have thought, oh, never won. But he did win, thanks to Carmelo Anthony, mainly. Carmelo Anthony, who's, really one of the greatest NBA players, in the history of the league. And, Carmelo as a freshman, of course, Jerry McNamara as well, and Hakeem Warwick. They, basically get Boeheim his title in 2003. So he has that. And, he accomplished everything that he had to accomplish. Like, it was time. And what he means to that city, what he means to Syracuse is really, he's one of the most important people. I mean, he really is. He is treated kind of like a god up there. He really is. And so now at the age of 78, he retires. I'm not sure whether to term a retirement. It feels like it was a mutual thing, to be honest. I'm reading that he retired, and I think that there's validity to that. I do think that John Wildhack and company probably wanted to go in a different direction. And so now Adrian Autry takes over as head coach. Autry was a player at Syracuse in the early 90s and has been an assistant under Boeheim since 2011. So there's a lot to discuss there as well in terms of that decision. And it's not a surprise that they stayed in-house. And would I have loved for them to go somewhere else and go outside the program? Yes, that would have been my preference, but I understand it. And it was really between Autry and Jerry McNamara, and they went with Autry, who, again, like Autry and McNamara were on Boeheim's staff around the same time. McNamara was, I'm not sure what his title was. He wasn't an assistant. He was less than an assistant for a couple of years, and then was elevated as an assistant coach. This was around the time, this was after Bernie Fine, who, there was that sexual abuse allegations. Bernie Fine, who had been with Boeheim, I think from the beginning. And, obviously he was let go. Mike Hopkins was supposed to be the successor. Hopkins, who was basically the same era as Adrian Autry, maybe a year earlier. Like, Hopkins was a Syracuse player maybe a year or two before Autry. And Hopkins was seen as the successor. He was an assistant at Syracuse for 20 years and took over for Boeheim when, during the 15-16 season, when Boeheim was suspended for 9 games. And he stuck around the next year as well. But then when Boeheim decided that he was going to stay, Hopkins took a job at Washington and has been there ever since. And we'll see how long Hopkins, it doesn't really matter now. I guess they could circle back on it at a future date, but, I guess you kind of feel bad for Hopkins because it seemed like that was going to be his job. Didn't happen, didn't work out that way. And so Adrian Autry is the man. And I think in terms of retention, it's probably a good thing, right? The Syracuse has a lot of freshmen, a lot of young players. And so it's good for the program in terms of maybe keeping some of those players, being familiar with Autry. We'll see what it means in terms of recruitment. We'll see what it means. It could help. It might help as far as bringing in some new players, but it might hurt. Look, Jim Boeheim is obviously a brand name, so I can't say I know how that's going to go. And how will the coaching style be? I mean, I like what it will mean in terms of just from a coach to player. Forget about X's and O's, just in terms of, I think Autry will be able to relate more to his, players. Boeheim was an old school coach. He was, really, really tough on his players. And it made for very interesting, press conferences. I'll say that. But, Boeheim was just becoming more and more out of touch. And hopefully Autry can bridge that gap and can help with some of his players. So that's the Autry side of things, and we'll see how he does. Look, for me, the next coach after Autry, I would hope it's outside of the program, but we'll have to see. Look, that could be way down the line. Maybe it won't be way down the line. And what I think about is Jerry McNamara. I'm going to assume that McNamara stays on the staff, but you have to wonder whether he decides to go elsewhere. But my inclination would be that he would stay. And again, I don't know. I don't think I'd want McNamara to be the next head coach, but that is presumptuous at best. And so we'll see what Autry does. Now let's circle back with Boeheim. It was, I don't want to say long overdue, but this is a good day. It really is a good day. On a day where Syracuse loses in the ACC tournament to Wake Forest, it's just a classic Boeheim loss. It really was, where Syracuse they can't get it done at the end. A game in which, really, in context of the last possession that Syracuse had, most teams at worst get that to overtime, and in most cases win it. Syracuse loses it in regulation. And so just from an X's and O's standpoint, I'm not really sure what Boeheim was bringing to the table in recent years. That patented 2-3 zone really just hasn't been a thing anymore. Look, it was obviously very successful for a very long time, but I feel like Boeheim just didn't have, in his bag of tricks. I just feel like it was limited. And look, he knows a lot more than I do, but I just feel like a change was needed. A change was absolutely needed. And it's interesting that he didn't leave when his sons left last season. You would have thought that would have been a time where he'll leave with Jimmy and Buddy. But he didn't. He stuck around one more year, and he kind of shed some light on that in his presser, the post-game presser today. That I guess he felt like it was the right thing to do because the new players coming in, he told them that he'd be their head coach. So I guess he feels like he filled that obligation. I'm sure there was more that went into it, and honestly, if this year went better, I definitely think that Boeheim would have been here next season. I really think that. I don't think he knew. I don't think the university knew. But as the season transpired, this was what it was. I want to touch on Boeheim's career, mainly in the scope of my fandom, which really begins, which I would consider it beginning in the, would it have been 99-2000 or 2000-2001? When did they lose to Hawaii? Not lose to Hawaii, beat Hawaii and lose to Kansas, I believe it was. Might have been 2000-2001. Let me just confirm. Yes, 2000-2001. So my fandom really dates back to Preston Shumpert and Damone Brown and Deshaun Williams. Of course, Queth Duaney, who was a senior on the 03 championship team. So I've seen, this team from before, that they won. And they were good at that time. But look, 02, the year before they won the championship, they were an NIT team. They did not make the NCAA tournament. And so 2003 ends up being Boeheim's crowning achievement. He wins the national championship. And, that was unexpected. And that was mainly because of Carmelo Anthony, Jerry McNamara, Hakeem Warwick as a sophomore. and their number, McNamara and Warwick's numbers, were just retired this past Sunday. But you have that, and there's a good amount of success in the mid 2000s. The mid 2000s, you have a couple of Big East when Syracuse was in the Big East, and we'll touch on that chronologically. But Syracuse in the mid 2000s, what you think about is a couple of really nice Big East championships, which they won in 2005 and 2006, followed by first-round exits in the NCAA tournament. So you take the good with the bad there, where they were upset. Now, 2006 was an amazing run by Jerry McNamara as a senior. So at this point, Eric Devendorf's a freshman. Warwick has graduated at this point. Josh Pace has graduated. So, 05 was kind of the end of what was on the 03, besides McNamara still being there in 06. And what an amazing run that was. So that was fun. So you have a lot of good moments there. 07 was a total snub. 07, they were completely snubbed. I don't know how they didn't make it. This is where, at this point, it's Demetrius Nichols is a big part of this team. And, right, Demetrius Nichols is a senior. Terrence Roberts is a senior. Darrell Watkins is also a senior. And of course, Eric Devendorf, a sophomore. You're starting to see some younger players come into the mix, like Andy Routens, Arinze Onuaku. But for Syracuse, it ends up in disappointment where they reach the NIT. 08, kind of a similar situation where they could have made it. 07, they had much more of a case. They were on the bubble, didn't make it, so another NIT appearance. And this is where Dante Green was a freshman and left. Johnny Flynn was a freshman, sticks around. And then things start to turn around. 2009, Syracuse reaches the Sweet 16. And this is a season in which this was a good, this was a pretty solid Syracuse team. They were a 3 seed. They beat James Harden and Arizona State in the second round. They lose to Blake Griffin and Oklahoma in the Sweet 16. But there's a lot of turnover. And this is also, of course, the year where they win the 6 overtime game against UConn at Madison Square Garden. So that is obviously goes down as one of the greatest games in the history of sports, honestly. Now, I become a student at Syracuse University in the 09-10 season, and I believe my 4 years there were, I think, the winningest 4-year span of any time. So I would say that I was at Syracuse basketball-wise the best time, other than if you were there during 03. 03 championship, nothing beats that, in my opinion. Especially as being a fan, I was younger, but nothing beats that. But if you take that out of the equation, being there from the 2010 to 2013 season was fun. They were really good teams. And this was kind of in some ways, the most recent peak of the Boeheim era. It extends a little bit further than that, and we'll talk about that a little further than that. But Boeheim, they were a 1 seed in 2010. Unfortunately, Arinze Onuaku goes down in the Big East tournament, and Syracuse eventually loses to Butler in the Sweet 16. That was disappointing. But yeah, that Onuaku injury was really, really big. 2011 was a decent year, but could have been better. That year, I think they might have been, were they a 3 seed that year as well in the tournament? I think they might have been. Yeah, they were a 3 seed. They lost to Marquette, who was also in the Big East. And so pretty good season though. And then 2012, a really, really good season, a 1 seed. They end up finishing overall 34-3. And that was the Fab Melo situation. And rest in peace, Fab Melo, who has unfortunately since passed away. But Fab Melo, there was, and I guess that led into eventually what happened where Boeheim gets suspended years later, where it was an academic issue with Fab Melo. I think that, he was, there was some cheating. I can't remember specifically what happened, but I think that the grades that he was receiving were a little bit faulty. This sort of thing did happen, but I guess maybe they found that it was a bit egregious. And so, unfortunately, Fab Melo wasn't in the mix there, which hurt. That was a really good team. But then for me, fond memories for the 2010 team, but 2013 might have been, probably was the worst of the four, but that team reaches the Final Four. That team reaches the Final Four, and it was crazy. My senior year was the last year of Syracuse being in the Big East, so pretty cool symmetry there. And then, the ACC starts next season, but they reach the Final Four. They lose to Michigan, and this is where Michael Carter-Williams is a sophomore, and you have seniors like Brandon Trish, James Sutherland, and Jeremy Grant is somewhat of an unknown freshman who was really good. And there's Rakeem Christmas is on the team, a whole bunch of others. And they make a really nice run. They knock off Indiana. That was probably the biggest moment. They knock off Indiana in the Sweet 16. Then the good times continue, where a really good 2014 season, where the most memorable moment there, Tyler Ennis as a freshman hits a half-court shot to beat Pitt at Pitt. But Syracuse unfortunately goes down early. They go down in the round of 32. They lose to Dayton. So Syracuse was a 3 seed. They lose to Dayton. And then 2015, Syracuse was so in 2015, Syracuse was ineligible. And this is where all this, stuff happens, where it was a self-imposed postseason ban for an ongoing investigation into potential past infractions by the team academically. They weren't going to make it anyway, so it was self-imposed, but they weren't going to make it. And then the next season is when Hopkins starts the season as head coach. Boeheim takes over, and Syracuse has this magical run to the Final Four. So 2 times in 4 seasons, Syracuse is Final Four bound. And this was even more unexpected, where Syracuse gets in as a 10 seed. They almost didn't make it. I mean, I remember them announcing, I was surprised. It was like one of the last announced teams. And they actually beat Dayton, ironically. And they had some breaks. Michigan State got knocked off, but ultimately they lose to North Carolina. They lose to North Carolina in the Final Four handedly, but the amazing win was they beat Virginia in the Elite Eight, a really good Virginia team, which eventually won a national championship. An amazing comeback led by Malachi Richardson and Tyler Lydon. Just an amazing, amazing run. You had Michael Benajay on that team and Trevor Cooney. That 16 team, definitely some fond memories of that team. And there was some slight carryover to me as a student, barely, with DeJuan Coleman, who contributed a little bit on the 2013 Final Four team. But you have that. Then they go back to being an NIT team in 2017, where that was with Andrew White and John Gillen, players like that. There was definitely a new-looking team, a lot of transfers that came in at that point. And then there's a couple of, to get into it a little more quickly, things start to, at this point, the powerhouse that they were in the late 2000s and the early to mid 2010s is no longer. They're basically a bubble team from here on out. But in 2018, it's a nice Sweet 16 run where, again, they make it in the play-in. They beat Arizona State in the play-in. Then they beat TCU, and they beat Michigan State, which was, a really, really nice win. And Michigan State at that time was, I guess they were a 3 seed. Right, that makes sense. And then they play number 2 seeded Duke, and they lose. A close game, a really close game. You have Tyus Battle on that team, Marek Dolezaj, Frank Howard was a senior. But that was a gutsy effort by that group, which, again, really was right on the cusp, gets in and actually wins 3 games in the tournament. Then in 2019, they make it, and they kind of made it, I guess, for them somewhat easily. They were an 8 seed, but they lose in the first round to Baylor. And at this point, Buddy is a freshman. And then 2020, of course, they weren't going to make it in 2020. They were not going to make the tournament. 2020 COVID happens, so there's no tournament anyway. And then the last really good run was 2021, where Buddy Boeheim really is the engineer in it. Joe Girard, of course, makes an impact, and others, as Syracuse beats San Diego State. They beat West Virginia. Syracuse was an 11 seed. and they lose to Houston handedly. So there were, and at this point, it's like, wow, how is Boeheim kind of pulling this out of his ass? Like, it was kind of, that was impressive. Whereas before, there was disappointments in the NCAA tournament where they had these nice Big East runs and they got knocked out early. Here, Syracuse really has done next to nothing in the ACC tournaments. Like, ever since they've been in the ACC, they have not done well in the conference tournaments, but there were a couple of really impressive runs. And so now, last year, didn't work out with his sons on the team. You had Cole Swider as well. And then this year, as I just said, they go down. They weren't going to, the last 2 seasons, they really weren't even close. They didn't make the NIT last year, and they didn't make the NIT this year. And that last year was the first year where they finished under 500 ever in Jim Boeheim's coaching career. And this year they were above 500, but again, things were as bad as they've been in a while. And I just wanted to go through, I wanted to, give Boeheim his due, but also say this. I was a big proponent of Jim Boeheim being gone. I'm very happy. Don't make no mistake about it. I'm very happy that this is over. I really am. He's a nasty guy. He, and look, how he is off the court, and, I'm not going to judge that, but in the press conferences, he's just very irritable and, cranky. I could use a lot of different words, and look, it's the way it is. Not very nice to some of the younger, especially some of the younger reporters too. He really just buries them. It'll be nice to have, just a different face. Again, can't take away anything that he did. He will go down as one of the greatest coaches of all time. And do I think he's a little bit overrated? I do, but I'd be a fool to say that what he did, is unmatched. So, Adrian Autry has big shoes to fill, but I'm excited that there'll be a new voice, and very interested in seeing where things go from here. As far as the roster right now, you have seniors Jesse Edwards and Joe Girard, who you'd expect them to be gone. They do, because of the COVID year, they can return. But the way I see it is, it's unfortunate. Girard, to me, would seem to be more likely to come back. Edwards, I think, is definitely gone. Jesse Edwards, I think, there's a bright future there. He needs to bulk up. But I think Edwards, there's, definitely room for growth. Like, there's a lot of upside with Jesse Edwards, and, it's in his best interest to leave. I think he will. Girard, there's a world in which he comes back. I don't think he will, if I had to guess, but he might. But I really don't even want him back. I'm just kind of done with Joe Girard. So I know that he's probably better than the alternative, but I kind of want Girard to be gone. I feel like, I don't think he really got much better. From freshman to senior year, I don't think he really got better. I think you could even argue, as far as I can remember it, I feel like his freshman year was maybe his best. And that's just my opinion. Obviously, he had some really big games, really good shooter. But, we'll see. But I think Girard's gone. And then Judah Mintz is the other big question. Judah Mintz, I really hope he returns. And it's the classic thing, especially with Syracuse, where these players leave. The first chance they get, they leave. And so if I had to guess based on that, he probably goes. But I think it'd be wise for him to stick around. And with this coaching change, what does that mean? Boeheim to Autry. Is it now more likely that he stays? Is it now more likely that he leaves? We'll find out. And then there's just a bunch of freshmen with some bright futures. But if you do lose all 3 of those players that I just mentioned, it makes it tough. So I think Syracuse is in a tough spot. Although, and also Benny Williams, the sophomore, he might transfer as well. And it's kind of bittersweet, where Benny had a great game against Wake today. It's been a really tough 2 seasons. And it was kind of good riddance, but now it's like, wait a minute, maybe we want this guy to stick around. So there could be a lot of turnover. We'll see. But long story short, Jim Boeheim out after 47 seasons as head coach, almost 60 years at Syracuse University. And now Adrian Autry is the successor. Adrian Autry is the new head coach at Syracuse University. It's the end of an era. And it'll be very interesting to see where things go from here.